The man who ran Stalin's torture machine, who perfected the art of extracting false confessions, was arrested in 1953, tortured, made to confess, then shot. It is a perfect closed loop of destruction. You build an apparatus to hunt traitors. You give it unlimited power. You strip away the law, replacing it with ideological purity. You feed it bodies, millions of them. But eventually the real threats are gone. The jails are full, but the quotas remain. So you manufacture new ones. You turn the lens inward. You purge the ranks. You purge the purgers. What happens when a system designed to find enemies runs out of real ones? It doesn't stop. It can't. Stopping means admitting it was wrong. And in this system, admitting wrong was the same as confessing guilt. The machine must be fed. And when the outside world is empty, the machine eats itself. Okay, let's unpack this. That was a relentlessly dark way to start, but I mean, we are stepping into the absolute darkest corners of the 20th century today.
Yeah, we really are. It doesn't get much darker.
Right. So we are taking you on a deep dive into the Soviet terror apparatus. We're looking at the terrifying rise, the bureaucratic reign, and the sudden violent fall of Lavrentiy Beria.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore the shockwave that followed his destruction, which is Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech.
Which is just a monumental moment in history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So our mission here today isn't just to recite a timeline of atrocities. We're pulling from historical archives, biographies, translated excerpts of the secret speech itself, and documentaries. And the goal is to understand the mechanics. Like, how does an ideological machine function when it's built entirely on institutionalized paranoia?
Well, we have to look at this through the lens of organizational psychology, I think, and bureaucratic momentum, just as much as political history.
Right.
Because we're examining an ecosystem where survival required this constant, terrifying adaptation to, shifting definitions of reality. To understand how the machine eventually turned its gears on its own architects, we have to first break down the underlying architecture of fear. I mean, how do you industrialize paranoia?
That's the core question right there.
Exactly. How do you create a system where the administrators of death are simultaneously the masters of the state and its most vulnerable hostages?
Yeah, and before we can understand how this machine ate itself in the 1950s, we have to look at the blueprints. We have to go back to the beginning.
We do.
Because the secret police didn't just, materialize out of the ether during Stalin's Great Purge in the 1930s. There's a distinct evolution here. We're moving from the chaotic, desperate violence of the 1917 revolution to a highly structured, spreadsheet-driven terror network.
Right, and the foundation stone for all of that is the Cheka.
The Cheka.
Yeah. Following the October 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in what was functionally a localized coup in Petrograd. And they immediately found themselves surrounded.
I mean, completely surrounded.
Oh, completely. They faced massive popular opposition, a sprawling civil war against the White Armies, and direct military intervention from foreign powers.
Right.
So to secure the survival of this nascent, fragile state, Vladimir Lenin established the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission.
Which is a mouthful.
Yeah, the Cheka, in December 1917, under the command of Felix Dzerzhinsky.
Now, my understanding is that the Cheka was pitched as a temporary emergency measure. Like, it was supposed to be a temporary investigative body, right?
That was the initial pitch, yes.
But almost overnight, it morphed into something much more terrifying.
It acquired the power of summary justice practically immediately. This was the mechanism of the Red Terror. The Cheka bypassed the courts entirely. They could arrest, interrogate, sentence, and execute an individual in the span of a few hours, often just in the basement of the Lubyanka building.
That's horrifying.
But the Marxist-Leninist justification for this violence was strictly bound to the context of the Civil War. The rationale was that the terror was a blunt instrument applied against the exploiting classes,
The aristocracy, the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, exactly. The former czarist officers. These were people who were actively militarily fighting to crush the revolution.
Okay, I want to push back on that framing just slightly, because Lenin wasn't exactly a reluctant participant in the terror, He actively demanded mass executions of kulaks and priests.
He did. He absolutely did.
But I take the point that there is a distinct ideological shift between Lenin's era and Stalin's era. And that shift becomes the entire foundation of Khrushchev's argument decades later.
You raise a really vital distinction there. Lenin's terror was catastrophic, but it had a theoretical endpoint, which was the end of the Civil War.
Right.
Once the Civil War concluded and the Bolsheviks solidified control, the Cheka was disbanded. It was replaced by the GPU, the Start Political Directorate, and later the OGPU.
So things calmed down a bit.
The overt street-level repression was noticeably dialed back during the 1920s. The enemies were supposedly defeated, the exploiting classes were broken.
But then, Joseph Stalin maneuvers his way into absolute power. And here is where the logic flips. Instead of the terror fading away as the Soviet state secures its borders, the terror actually expands.
It mutates.
Yeah, it transforms from a weapon used against hostile armies into a weapon used against the general population.
Yeah.
And the historical consensus points to a very specific trigger for this, right? The industrial-scale terror of the 1930s starts with the murder of Sergei Kirov on December 1st, 1934.
Sergei Kirov is the pivot point of Soviet history. He was a highly charismatic figure, a full member of the ruling Politburo, and the leader of the Leningrad Party apparatus.
And people loved him.
He was immensely popular among the party elite, perhaps too popular.
Yeah.
There were murmurs at the 17th Party Congress in 1934 that some delegates secretly approached Kirov to replace Stalin as general secretary.
Oh, wow. So he was a direct threat.
Well, Kirov declined and reportedly told Stalin about the approach, but in Stalin's mind, popularity was indistinguishable from treason. So, on the afternoon of December 1st, 1934, Kirov was shot in the back of the neck in the corridors of the Smolny Institute in Leningrad by a young, disgruntled party member named Leonid Nikolaev.
I was reviewing the timeline of that assassination, and it is just riddled with bizarre anomalies. It reads like a terribly scripted conspiracy. Walk me through the security failures here, because it seems impossible that a lone gunman could just stroll up to a Politburo member.
The anomalies are glaring, honestly. A month and a half prior to the assassination, Nikolaev was detained by security forces after he was found loitering near Kirov's usual route.
Okay.
And he had a loaded revolver in his briefcase.
Wait, a loaded gun near a Politburo member?
Exactly. But instead of being interrogated or sent to the gulag, he was inexplicably released. His weapon was returned to him.
That makes zero sense.
It gets worse. Even more damning, on the day of the murder, Kirov's primary Chekist bodyguard, a man named Borisov, was not walking directly behind him as protocol demanded.
Where was he?
Borisov was lingering far behind in the stairwell.
And Borisov didn't live long enough to explain why, did he?
He did not. The following day, Borisov was being transported in a truck to be interrogated by Stalin, who had rushed to Leningrad to personally oversee the investigation.
Convenient.
The truck got into a minor accident. The side of the truck scraped a wall. Absolutely no one else in the vehicle was injured, but Borisov was killed.
Just Borisov.
Just Borisov. The subsequent medical reports, which were later examined by Khrushchev's investigators in the 1950s, indicated that Borisov's skull had been crushed by metal bars wielded by the NKVD agents riding with him.
Oh my God.
So the entire sequence of events strongly implies that the NKVD, the successor to the GPU, orchestrated the assassination on Stalin's orders to create a massive pretext.
A pretext to unleash the machine. Because Stalin doesn't waste a single hour. Literally on the evening of December 1st, while the country is still reacting to the news, Stalin drafts and initiates a new legal directive.
The December 1st directive.
Right. It fundamentally alters the Soviet legal code. It strips away the right to defense counsel. It removes the right to pardon for anyone accused of terroristic acts. And it demands the immediate execution of death sentences the moment they're passed.
No appeals.
No reviews. It just accelerates the conveyor belt of death. And to make this conveyor belt run smoothly, Stalin weaponizes a specific, chilling phrase: enemy of the people.
That phrase is the master key to the psychology of the Great Terror. The term enemy of the people was a stroke of dark bureaucratic genius.
How so?
By designating an individual with that label, the state completely circumvented the need to prove practical guilt. You didn't need to uncover a plot. You didn't need to prove an ideological deviation.
Just the label was enough.
Suspicion, a malicious rumor, or simply possessing an inconvenient background was sufficient. The label itself became the entirety of the evidence. It short-circuited the legal process entirely.
I look at this mechanism like a societal autoimmune disease. You know how an autoimmune disorder works, right? The body's internal defense system is tricked into attacking perfectly healthy tissue because the definition of what constitutes a foreign body has been completely corrupted by the system itself.
That's a really apt analogy.
The state's defense mechanism, the NKVD, was weaponized against its own healthy cells.
Yeah.
The engineers, the generals, the factory managers. But here's the piece I always struggle to wrap my head around.
Okay.
We're talking about the old Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
These are hardened revolutionaries who fought the Tsar's secret police, who survived years of Siberian exile, who commanded armies in a brutal civil war. Why'd so many of these tough, uncompromising people just stand up in open court during the Moscow trials and confess to these absurd, fabricated crimes?
That is the enduring mystery for many observers, but the archives provide a brutally clear answer. It wasn't a sudden crisis of faith or a bizarre psychological phenomenon, as some Western observers theorized at the time. It was the result of this systemic, industrialized application of physical and psychological destruction. The investigative judges were no longer investigators, they were extractors. The system functioned on quotas.
Hold on, let's break down that quota system
Yeah.
because that is a terrifying concept.
Mm.
Are you saying the terror state was literally running on a production schedule like a tractor factory?
That is an accurate analogy, yeah. The central leadership in Moscow would send down target numbers to the regional NKVD bosses.
Literal numbers.
They would mandate, for example, that a specific province needed to uncover and eliminate 3,000 enemies, and these were categorized. Category 1 meant execution by shooting. Category 2 meant 10 years in the gulag.
Wow.
But the local party bosses, terrified of being perceived as soft on counter-revolutionaries.
So that would make them targets.
Exactly. So they would routinely write back to Moscow begging to increase their quotas.
Just kidding.
No. A regional boss might ask to raise his Category 1 quota from 3,000 to 5,000 just to prove his vigilance. It was a macabre bidding war, a bureaucratic competition measured in human lives.
And to fill those newly expanded quotas, you need confessions. Fast. You can't spend 6 months building a legitimate legal case.
Precisely. The confession became the sole required proof of guilt, which violated every established norm of legal science. And to guarantee those confessions, the state normalized torture.
Right.
There's a deeply disturbing telegram in the archives sent by Stalin to regional party secretaries and NKVD heads in 1939. In it, he officially sanctions what he termed methods of physical pressure against the arrested.
Physical pressure.
He provided the ideological cover for this by arguing that bourgeois intelligence services used brutal methods against socialists, so the Soviet intelligence service shouldn't be constrained by humanitarian squeamishness when dealing with enemies of the working class.
So he essentially legalizes torture at a mass scale, but couches it in this defensive ideological language.
Right. He instructed the NKVD that physical pressure was obligatory. They would take these hardened revolutionaries, men who had withstood czarist prisons, and subject them to the conveyor.
What was the conveyor?
It meant continuous, relentless interrogation, keeping them awake for a week straight, beating them with rubber truncheons, breaking their ribs.
Good Lord.
But perhaps the most effective tool was the threat to their families. The interrogator would place a pre-written script on the desk, a script detailing a fabricated plot to sabotage a railway or assassinate a leader.
And they'd just say, sign it.
They'd tell the prisoner, sign this, and your wife and children go to a labor camp, but they live, refuse, and we shoot them tomorrow. Under those conditions, the human mind just shatters. They signed the scripts.
And to justify why there were suddenly thousands of these supposed spies and saboteurs everywhere, Stalin introduces a twisted new theoretical doctrine. He has to explain why a country that's supposedly marching toward a socialist utopia is suddenly crawling with traitors.
Yeah, he introduced the doctrine of the aggravation of the class struggle.
Okay, what is that?
Stalin argued that as the Soviet Union grew stronger and moved closer to true socialism, the remnants of the old exploiting classes would realize their historical time was running out.
So they'd fight harder.
Therefore, the resistance would become more desperate, more hidden, and more violent. So the class war would actually sharpen as they approached utopia.
Wow.
It was a perfectly sealed circular logic. The immense scale of the terror proved that the enemies existed, and the existence of these hidden enemies necessitated even more terror.
Okay, so you have this vast, brutal, self-justifying machine. But a machine of this magnitude, processing millions of files and bodies, it doesn't run itself. It requires a very specific kind of operator.
It does.
You can't run an industrialized death machine with passionate ideologues. They either burn out, lose their nerve, or get purged themselves. The system fundamentally required an administrator, an accountant of death who viewed terror not as a crusade, but as a logistics problem. And that is where Lavrentiy Beria enters the frame.
Lavrentiy Beria. He is the ultimate architect of the Soviet security state. Like Stalin, Beria was born in Georgia. He joined the Bolshevik faction early on and gravitated toward counterintelligence work during the incredibly chaotic and violent years of the Russian Civil War in the Transcaucasus region.
Right.
He integrated himself into the Cheka and quickly built a reputation for immense administrative capability paired with just utter ruthlessness.
I was reading about his early career, specifically his role in crushing a Georgian nationalist uprising in 1924, and the sheer duplicity is staggering.
Oh, it's notorious.
He supposedly met with the rebel leaders, promised them that if they laid down their arms, the mass executions of their comrades would immediately stop. They surrendered to save their people, and Beria immediately had thousands of them slaughtered. Some estimates say up to 10,000 people.
Yes.
And Moscow rewarded him for it. He got the Order of the Red Banner.
Beria understood the unwritten mechanics of power in Stalin's system better than anyone. He recognized that advancement required two distinct skill sets: the complete preemptive elimination of any potential rivals and absolute fawning subservience to the man at the top.
I mean, he was good at both.
Beria excelled at both. He turned flattery into an art form.
He actually ghost wrote a history book, didn't he? Just to stroke Stalin's ego.
He did. In 1935, a book was published under Beria's name titled On the Question of the History of the Bolshevik Organizations in Transcaucasia.
Matchy title.
It was a monumental work of historical fiction. The book systematically erased the contributions of other prominent revolutionaries in the region and retroactively portrayed Joseph Stalin as the sole, heroic, flawless leader of the revolutionary movement in the Caucasus.
Wow.
Stalin's vanity was notoriously insatiable, and he loved the book. It was heavily promoted across the Soviet Union, and it cemented Beria's position as a highly favored, highly reliable loyalist.
So Beria is building his power base in Georgia, essentially running his own mini fiefdom. But meanwhile, the Great Purge, the absolute zenith of the terror from roughly 1936 to 1938, is being run from Moscow by a man named Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD.
Yezhov was a fanatic.
Yeah, he's purging the country with such chaotic violence that he is actively destroying the Soviet economy, paralyzing the railways, and decapitating the military hierarchy right as the threat of Nazi Germany is rising.
Exactly.
And then, amazingly, Beria manages to survive this purge, gets called to Moscow, and actually replaces Yezhov. How does a guy as visibly dangerous and power-hungry as Beria survive in the same realm as Stalin? Stalin was incredibly paranoid. He purged loyalists for minor slights. Why keep a shark like Beria in the tank?
Because Beria managed Stalin's neuroses flawlessly, he made himself the indispensable solution to Stalin's anxieties. Beria's entire operating philosophy is crystallized in his infamous motto,
Which was?
"Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." He didn't challenge Stalin's paranoia, he serviced it. If Stalin mused that a certain factory manager seemed suspicious, Beria didn't investigate to find the truth. He instantly produced a pristine file of evidence, a signed confession, and a quiet execution.
He was a fixer.
He was incredibly efficient. By late 1938, Stalin recognized that Yezhov's chaotic bloodletting was destabilizing the state apparatus to a dangerous degree. He needed to hit the brakes. So he brought Beria to Moscow as Yezhov's first deputy.
Which was the kiss of death for Yezhov. Bringing in a powerful deputy was always the first step in the replacement process.
It was an open secret in the Kremlin. Within months, Beria systematically isolated Yezhov, replaced Yezhov's men with his own loyalists from Georgia, and eventually oversaw Yezhov's removal, arrest, and execution.
Right.
Beria took absolute control of the NKVD, and he did, in fact, wind down the sheer chaotic volume of the Great Purge. The mass randomized arrests slowed down, but we must be very careful not to mistake this for liberalization or mercy.
Definitely not.
Beria simply hated inefficiency. He replaced the chaotic slaughter with a highly organized, economically driven system of repression.
Economically driven. This is where we need to dive into the mechanisms of the Gulag. Because under Beria, the Gulag isn't just a series of punitive prison camps. It becomes a central pillar of the entire Soviet economy. He expands it massively. He turns millions of prisoners into an expendable slave labor force.
It was an empire within an empire. Beria recognized that millions of bodies sitting in prison cells were a drain on state resources. He transformed the main administration of camps, the Gulag, into the largest single employer in Europe.
Wow.
His prisoners mined gold in Kolyma, they laid the railways across the frozen tundra, they cut timber in the taiga. Later, after the Second World War, Beria was placed in charge of the Soviet atomic bomb project.
I didn't know that.
He used Gulag labor to mine the uranium, build the secret research cities, and construct the testing facilities. The human cost was simply factored into the spreadsheets as a resource expenditure.
Just a line item.
The caloric intake of a prisoner was mathematically tied to their daily work output. If you failed to meet your logging quota in the freezing cold, your bread ration was cut, ensuring you would fail the next day and rapidly starve to death.
And the sheer administrative coldness of his operations. Let's look at the Katyn massacre in 1940. It's one of the most chilling examples of bureaucratic mass murder in history.
Following the Soviet Union's partition of Poland with Nazi Germany in 1939, the NKVD took tens of thousands of Polish prisoners of war. These were not just soldiers, they were the Polish elite. Officers, university professors, doctors, lawyers, priests.
Right.
They were held in various camps in Western Russia. On March 5, 1940, Beria drafted a memo to Stalin. The memo was brief and coldly logical. He stated that these prisoners were hardened, irreconcilable enemies of the Soviet state. There was no plan to integrate them. Therefore, Beria proposed the supreme penalty, execution by shooting.
And Stalin just signed it.
Stalin, along with the rest of the Politburo, signed the memo.
And the logistics of carrying out that order are horrifying.
It was an industrial operation. Over 22,000 Polish citizens were transported to the Katyn Forest and other sites. They were taken into specially soundproofed rooms or led to the edge of massive trenches.
Yeah?
NKVD executioners, wearing leather butcher's aprons and long gloves to protect their uniforms from blood, shot them one by one in the back of the head.
That is just bleak.
They specifically used German-made Walther pistols because the standard Soviet sidearms would overheat and jam from the sheer volume of continuous firing. It took a month to process the executions. This was Beria's administration at work.
It is unfathomable. And Stalin knew exactly what kind of monster he had running his security apparatus. During the Yalta Conference in 1945, when the Allied leaders met to discuss the post-war world, Stalin literally introduced Lavrentiy Beria to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt by saying, "This is our Heinrich Himmler."
Which is astounding.
He openly compared his own chief of police to the architect of the Nazi Holocaust, and he said it as a lighthearted quip.
It speaks volumes about the terrifying normalization of state terror within the Soviet leadership. But what makes Beria uniquely monstrous, distinguishing him even from other ruthless Soviet bureaucrats, was his deep personal sadism.
Right.
He didn't just sign death warrants from the comfort of a mahogany desk, he engaged in the violence directly. The archives contain testimony regarding the interrogation of a former high-ranking party official named Robert Eike.
Got it.
Eike had been a loyal Stalinist, but he fell victim to the purge. Beria had Eike brought into his own office. Beria stood there, watching, as his lead interrogator viciously beat Eike, eventually gouging out Eike's eye to extract a false confession.
Which brings us to a part of the narrative that moves beyond political terror and into the realm of a true crime nightmare. Because Beria sounds less like a politician and more like a monstrous serial killer who somehow got the nuclear codes and the backing of a superpower, we have to address what was happening in Moscow at night.
The accounts provided by his former bodyguards and surviving victims are deeply disturbing. Beria used the vast power, the absolute secrecy, and the immense resources of the state security apparatus to operate as a prolific serial sexual predator.
Sickening.
His personal security detail testified that he would frequently be driven around the streets of Moscow in his armored Packard limousine. If he spotted a young woman on the sidewalk who caught his attention, he would point her out. His agents would then pull up, force her into the car, and deliver her to his fortified mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya Street.
Imagine the psychological terror. You're walking home and suddenly the secret police grab you and take you to the house of the most feared man in the country. And the psychological games he played were twisted. He would force them to dine with him, he would rape them, and then the next morning there was a specific, horrifying ritual as they left.
The ritual of the flowers.
Yep.
As the victim was escorted out by the guards, they would be handed a bouquet of flowers. The guards testified later that accepting the flowers was deemed to mean the encounter was consensual, a grotesque mockery of courtship.
What if they refused?
If a woman refused the flowers, it was an insult to Beria. The refusal guaranteed that she, and very likely her parents and siblings, would be arrested by the NKVD and sent to the Gulag.
There is a highly documented story about the famous Soviet actress Tatyana Okinevskaya. Beria essentially held her family hostage. He told her he could arrange for her father and grandmother to be released from prison if she submitted to him.
Right.
She was brought to his dacha. He raped her, explicitly told her that screaming was useless because no one would dare intervene, and then, after violating her, he had her arrested and sent to the gulag anyway.
His sense of impunity was absolute. He controlled the police force, the investigators, and the judges. There was no mechanism for justice. And for many women, the fate was far worse than the labor camps.
Oh, God.
In the 1990s, the Tunisian government took over Beria's former Moscow mansion to use as their embassy. During renovations, construction workers digging in the garden unearthed the skeletal remains of multiple young women. Beria was abducting, violating, and murdering citizens in the heart of the capital.
And everyone in the inner circle knew. It was an open secret in the Kremlin. Stalin himself allegedly told his own teenage daughter, Svetlana, that she should never be left alone in a room with Beria. The absolute dictator of the Soviet Union has to warn his daughter to stay away from his own chief of police.
It's incredible.
It is a level of darkness that's difficult to process. So you have this massive terror machine run by a sadistic predator serving a deeply paranoid dictator.
Yeah.
And then the ultimate crisis hits. World War II.
The Great Patriotic War.
Right. The Soviet Union suffers unimaginable devastation. Tens of millions dead. Cities leveled. But ultimately, they win. They raise the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. They defeat Nazi Germany. From a logical standpoint, you would think that surviving and winning the biggest war in human history would validate the system, ease the internal tension, and perhaps reduce the need for terror.
You would think that, yes.
But according to the historical record, absolute victory only gave Stalin's paranoia a larger canvas.
It's a crucial psychological observation. To understand the post-war madness in the Kremlin, we have to examine the trauma of how the war actually began for the Soviet Union. When Adolf Hitler broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact and invaded in June 1941, Stalin was utterly paralyzed.
He had ignored everyone.
Yeah.
The British intelligence warnings, his own spies like Richard Sorge in Japan. He refused to believe Hitler would fight a two-front war.
Exactly. He was convinced the intelligence was British provocation designed to drag the USSR into the conflict. When the panzer divisions rolled across the border, Stalin initially forbade his frontline troops from returning fire, believing it might just be rogue German generals acting without Hitler's orders.
Wow.
The Soviet Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground within hours. The Red Army, which Stalin had severely weakened by purging its most experienced commanders just years prior, was collapsing. Entire armies were encircled and annihilated.
Khrushchev's later revelations detail that Stalin suffered a profound psychological breakdown in those first few days. He abandoned his post at the Kremlin. He retreated to his dacha in Kuntsevo. He reportedly cried out, "Lenin left us a great legacy and we've lost it forever."
He literally stopped giving orders for days.
The country was leaderless while the Germans were advancing hundreds of miles.
A delegation from the Politburo finally drove to his dacha. Stalin reportedly looked terrified when they entered, believing they had come to arrest and execute him for the military disaster.
Oh, wow.
Instead, they essentially begged him to take control and establish a state defense committee. Stalin recovered his nerve, and through the immense, unparalleled sacrifice of the Soviet people, they turned the tide of the war. But the psychological damage to Stalin was permanent.
He couldn't let it go.
After the war, he desperately needed to rewrite the narrative of his early failure. The victory was ascribed entirely to his military genius. But internally, his isolation increased. His persecution mania, as Khrushchev accurately diagnosed it, reached unbelievable dimensions.
He starts behaving like an aging, paranoid CEO who decides to fire his most competent board members simply because they are competent. He stops holding regular Central Committee plenums. He stops consulting the full Politburo. He creates these secretive ad hoc subcommittees, the quintets and sextets, to bypass the official government structure.
He isolates his oldest allies.
And he starts turning on the very people who helped him win the war.
A prime example of this post-war purge is the Leningrad affair, which began around 1949. Leningrad had suffered a horrific 872-day siege during the war. Hundreds of thousands starved to death. But the city's leadership had shown incredible resilience and had emerged as popular, competent heroes in the eyes of the public.
Right.
Men like Nikolai Vosnezhensky, who was a brilliant economic planner, and Stalin's first deputy premier, and Alexei Kuznetsov, a key party secretary. Their competence, their popularity, and their slight independence of thought made them massive threats in Stalin's increasingly paranoid mind.
And Beria, along with Georgy Malenkov, was right there, actively feeding the paranoia. Beria viewed these younger, capable leaders from Leningrad as direct rivals for the succession after Stalin.
Beria and Malenkov manufactured a web of anonymous letters and rumors suggesting the Leningrad leadership was forming an anti-party faction and attempting to set up a rival power center.
And Stalin just bought it.
Stalin, without demanding a shred of concrete evidence, ordered a sweeping investigation. Voznesensky, Kuznetsov, and dozens of other high-ranking officials were arrested, brutally tortured to extract false confessions, and executed. The purge cascaded downward. Over 2,000 people with even tenuous links to the Leningrad leadership were imprisoned, exiled, or fired from their jobs.
It was a complete decapitation of a competent administrative bloc, simply because they were perceived as too capable.
Exactly.
But the paranoia hits its absolute, most delusional peak with the doctor's plot. This is where it transitions from ruthless political maneuvering into pure, unrestrained conspiracy theory. Walk me through the mechanics of this delusion. How does a letter from 1948 suddenly become the basis for a national purge in 1952?
The doctor's plot is one of the most bizarre and terrifying episodes of late Stalinism. It was a state-sponsored, deeply anti-Semitic campaign based on a completely fabricated medical conspiracy. It originated with a letter written in 1948 by a cardiologist named Lydia Timoshuk. She wrote to the security organs claiming that several prominent medical specialists had intentionally misdiagnosed and improperly treated Andrei Zhidonov, a high-ranking Politburo member who died of a heart attack shortly after. At the time, the letter was largely ignored and filed away.
But then, years later, Stalin suddenly digs it out of the archives. Why?
By 1951, Stalin was brewing a broader, viciously anti-cosmopolitan and anti-Semitic campaign across the Soviet Union. He was increasingly suspicious of Soviet Jews, convinced they were loyal to the newly formed State of Israel or to the United States. He retrieved Timoshuk's letter and used it as the foundational proof of a massive, shadowy conspiracy.
Wow.
He alleged that a cabal of doctors, many of whom were Jewish and responsible for treating the Soviet elite, were acting as assassins under the direction of Western intelligence agencies and international Zionist organizations.
Wait, he targeted his own personal doctors?
Yes.
He ordered the arrest of eminent medical specialists, including his personal physician of many years, Dr. Vladimir Vinogradov. And the details of how Stalin managed this investigation are just astounding. He isn't delegating this. He's personally micromanaging the torture.
He took direct control of the interrogation process. He summoned his new Minister of State Security, Semyon Ignatiev, a man who was already terrified of his own shadow, and screamed at him.
What'd he say?
Stalin threatened Ignatiev directly, saying, "If you do not obtain confessions from the doctors, we will shorten you by a head." He issued explicit directives on the interrogation methods, ordering the guards to beat, and beat again.
Good grief.
He specifically demanded that the elderly Dr. Vinogradov be put in chains. This is the leader of a nuclear-armed superpower acting like an unhinged medieval king. His delusions knew no bounds. He even ordered the house of Kliment Vorshilov, one of his oldest, most loyal comrades from the Civil War days, to be bugged, accusing Vorshilov of being an English spy.
It reflects a total collapse of rational governance. The machine is spinning wildly out of control, fueled entirely by the dictator's fever dreams and the secret police's willingness to extract whatever confessions are required to keep themselves alive. Which leads to my biggest question.
Okay, what is it?
You have these guys in the inner circle, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, even Lavrenti Beria. They were in the room. They knew the doctor's plot was madness. They knew their own doctors were being beaten with rubber truncheons to falsely confess to murder. Why didn't anyone just stop him? If they collectively knew the boss had lost his mind, why didn't they push back?
This highlights the ultimate psychological trap of the cult of personality and the terror state. It wasn't just the sheer, visceral fear of death, although the fear of being dragged to the Lubyanka basement was ever present.
Right.
The system had been constructed over decades, so that questioning Stalin's judgment was mathematically equated with questioning the revolution itself. To push back, even slightly, was to admit ideological deviation. Furthermore, they were all deeply complicit.
That's true.
Every single man in that inner circle had signed death warrants. Every one of them had risen to the top by stepping over the bodies of their purged comrades. They were paralyzed by mutual distrust.
Like the prisoner's dilemma.
Exactly. If Khrushchev suggested to Malenkov that Stalin was acting irrationally, Malenkov might report him to Beria to save his own skin. They were atomized. They knew Beria's security apparatus was constantly watching, ready to manufacture a treason case against any of them the moment Stalin gave the nod.
They were completely trapped in the machine they helped build. And it seems highly likely that Stalin was laying the groundwork for another massive purge, one that would sweep away the remaining old guard, including Beria himself. The noose was tightening. But then, on March 1st, 1953, the gears suddenly grind to a halt.
The biological limit of the dictator is reached.
Stalin suffers a massive stroke at his dacha.
The events at the Kuncevo dacha over those few days are intensely dramatic and highly revealing of the psychological dynamics at play. Stalin was found lying on the floor of his dining room, soaked in his own urine, by his guards. But the guards were so terrified of disturbing him without permission that they waited hours before calling the Politburo members.
And when the leadership finally arrives, the deathbed scene is grotesque. Khrushchev's memoirs, which we always have to view with a critical eye, as he was heavily invested in managing his own historical image.
Oh, absolutely.
They describe a scene of incredible tension. He says that while Stalin was lying there unconscious, Beria was pacing around the room, spewing hatred, cursing Stalin and mocking the dying dictator. He was practically radiating relief and triumph.
But then...
Right. But the moment Stalin's eyelids fluttered or he showed a sign of returning consciousness, Beria threw himself to his knees and kissed Stalin's hand. And when Stalin slipped back into the coma, Beria stood up and spat on the floor. It's the ultimate portrait of a sycophant surviving in a terror state.
It perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of survival. Absolute simmering resentment masked by absolute groveling submission. Finally, on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died.
And the moment the dictator's breath stopped, the power vacuum was immense. The architecture of the state was built for one absolute ruler. Without him, the sharks immediately began to circle.
They did.
The leadership instantly forms a collective group, an uneasy troika, because no single individual is strong enough to claim the throne outright. Georgy Malenkov becomes the premier, the head of the government. But Lavrentiy Beria manages to combine the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security into one colossal super-ministry under his direct control.
He was incredibly powerful.
He commands the secret police, the internal border guards, the intelligence networks, and the vast gulag system. He is, without question, the most powerful and feared man in the country. And this is where the historical narrative takes a turn that is so bizarre, it feels like speculative fiction.
The 100 Days of Beria.
Yes. The architect of terror, the man who ordered the Katyn massacre, suddenly transforms into a liberal reformer. What on earth is he doing?
It remains one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the 20th century. Within weeks of Stalin's death, Beria initiates a sweeping, unilateral, and highly aggressive program of de-Stalinization. He immediately halts the investigation into the doctor's plot.
Right.
He releases the surviving doctors, publicly declaring that the case was a complete fabrication and that the confessions were obtained through illegal torture. By the end of March, he pushes through a massive amnesty decree that releases over 1 million prisoners from the Gulag system.
1 million people, with the stroke of a pen.
Yes. In April, he issues a secret directive officially banning the use of physical torture in Soviet prisons, ordering the destruction of the torture equipment in the Lubyanka. He returns passports to millions of citizens who had been forced into internal exile. He begins aggressively promoting local indigenous leaders in the various Soviet republics like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, pushing back heavily against the intense Russification policies Stalin had favored.
He even ventures into foreign policy. He proposes reunifying East and West Germany into a single, neutral, democratic state. He argued that forcing socialism on East Germany was too expensive and was unnecessarily inflaming the Cold War with the United States.
Okay, I have to stop you here because I struggle with the consensus on this. I don't buy the pragmatism argument entirely.
Fair enough.
Are you seriously suggesting that the absolute worst guy in the room, a prolific serial killer who industrialized slave labor, suddenly decided the Gulag was bad economics? Wasn't this just a desperate PR move to win public support because he knew Khrushchev and Malenkov were plotting to kill him?
It's a valid skepticism, and historians have debated his core motivations for decades. But the evidence strongly points to deep cynicism and extreme economic pragmatism rather than a moral awakening or simple PR. How so?
Beria was, above all, an administrator. He had run the Gulag. He knew the ledgers. He recognized that the terror machine had reached a point of diminishing returns. The slave labor system was actually a massive drain on the state budget. The cost of guarding, feeding, and transporting millions of prisoners in the frozen north was exceeding the value of the timber they cut or the gold they mined.
Right.
Furthermore, the Soviet Union was entering the nuclear age and the Cold War. Beria believed the country needed technological innovation and a streamlined economy, neither of which can flourish in a society paralyzed by the fear of arbitrary arrest. He wanted to dismantle a terror state not out of morality, but out of cold administrative utility. He wanted a functional, modern authoritarian state, not a paranoid slaughterhouse.
So it was a massive power play disguised as reform. He is attempting to modernize the state to make it stronger, while simultaneously positioning himself as the savior, the man who ended the terror.
Precisely. And this is exactly what terrified his rivals in the Kremlin. Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov didn't view Beria as a genuine reformer. They saw a ruthless pragmatist rapidly consolidating supreme power.
They didn't trust him for a second.
They were absolutely convinced that Beria's liberalization was a temporary ploy. They believed he was trying to lull them into a false sense of security while he gathered enough leverage to turn the secret police against the Presidium and purge them all. They knew intimately what he was capable of because Beria had the files on every single one of them. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had dug the graves.
They realize it's an existential threat. It's him or them.
Yeah.
But Beria is heavily guarded. He commands divisions of internal security troops right there in Moscow. They need a pretext, a moment of weakness to strike. And geopolitics hands them the perfect excuse in June 1953.
The unintended consequence of Beria's rapid liberalization dictates from Moscow was sudden destabilization in the Eastern Bloc. The socialist authorities in East Germany had slightly eased their hardline economic policies, mirroring the confusion in the Kremlin.
Right.
The East German workers, sensing weakness and frustrated by impossible work quotas, rose up. On June 16, 1953, a massive worker revolt exploded across East Germany. Hundreds of thousands of workers rioted against the communist government. It took Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin to crush the uprising.
And Khrushchev seizes on this instantly. He uses the crisis to turn the Presidium against Beria. He argues, look at what Beria's reckless reforms have caused. He is showing weakness to the West. He is an imperialist agent actively trying to dismantle the Soviet Empire from the inside.
It was a very effective argument.
Khrushchev manages to secretly cobble together an alliance. He gets Malenkov on board. He gets Molotov. But crucially, he needs muscle. He turns to the military, specifically Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the great hero of WWII.
The military brass deeply despised Beria. Beria's secret police had purged thousands of military officers before the war, and the NKVD constantly undermined military authority by embedding political commissars and informants in every unit.
So they were ready.
The generals were eager to eliminate him. Khrushchev orchestrated a highly dangerous trap. On June 26, 1953, a routine meeting of the Presidium, the new name for the Politburo, was called in the Kremlin.
The details of this ambush are incredible. The room is sealed. They sit down around the table. Suddenly, Khrushchev stands up and deviates entirely from the agenda. He launches a blistering verbal attack directly at Beria. He accuses him of being a careerist, a traitor, an English spy, and of attempting to seize dictatorial power.
Beria was completely blindsided.
He hasn't prepared his guards for this. He supposedly reaches for his briefcase, scribbling a note on a piece of paper that just says alarm. He looks at Khrushchev, bewildered, and says, "What's going on, Nikita Sergeyevich? Why are you picking fleas in my trousers?"
The mechanics of the two almost failed. The plan was for Malenkov, who was sharing the meeting, to press a secret buzzer hidden on his desk. This buzzer would signal Marshal Zhukov and a group of heavily armed military officers who were waiting anxiously in an adjoining room.
But Malenkov chokes.
He panicked. As Khrushchev was shouting, Malenkov lost his nerve and forgot to press the buzzer. Khrushchev had to verbally signal them. Zhukov and his men burst through the doors with their weapons drawn.
Wow.
Beria realized he was trapped. He pleaded with Malenkov to save him, but Zhukov commanded him to put his hands up. Beria was arrested on the spot, wrapped in a carpet to hide him, and smuggled out of the Kremlin in the trunk of a car to a military bunker.
The fall is absolute and instantaneous. The man who terrorized a nation of 200 million people is suddenly sitting in a damp cell. His trial later that year in December is held in secret. In a grim twist of irony, he is subjected to the very legal mechanisms he helped perfect.
Exactly.
He's denied defense counsel, he's denied the right to an appeal, and during the interrogations and the trial, The state finally brings his horrific personal crimes to light, the kidnappings, the rapes, the murders of the young women in Moscow. But they don't expose this to bring justice to the victims. They expose it to completely destroy his political legacy and ensure his execution.
The end of Lavrentiy Beria was pathetic. When the death sentence was handed down, the sources describe Beria completely breaking down. The cold, calculating administrator vanished.
Right.
He dropped to his knees. He begged the judges for his life. He was crying and wailing so uncontrollably that a military officer actually stuffed a rag into his mouth to silence him.
Good Lord.
He was dragged into a separate execution room from his co-defendants. General Pavel Batitsky, who had volunteered for the task, shot Beria point-blank in the forehead. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in a forest.
Erase.
And then came the ultimate Soviet cancellation. His name was quite literally scrubbed from history. The state mailed out new pages to all subscribers of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, pages about the Bering Strait, and explicitly instructed the citizens to take a razor blade, cut out the entry for Lavrentiy Beria, and paste the Bering Strait over it.
It is the ultimate erasure. The architect of the purge is purged. But his death leaves Khrushchev and the surviving leadership facing an impossible existential dilemma. Stalin is dead, Beria is dead, but the machine they built is still there. Millions of people are starting to return from the gulags. The whispers about the torture, the fabricated trials, the mass graves. The truth is leaking out. How do you govern a deeply traumatized nation without admitting that your entire government, the very system of power that puts you in charge, is fundamentally illegitimate?
That is the core crisis of 1956. Khrushchev recognized a dangerous buildup of pressure. If the Communist Party did not get ahead of the narrative, the pent-up trauma, grief, and anger of the population would eventually tear the system apart from the inside.
Right.
He needed a controlled demolition of Stalin's legacy. He needed to vent the pressure without destroying the foundation of the state. This high-wire act culminates in the 20th Party Congress in February 1956.
The Congress starts normally. It has its regular public sessions. Everything is heavily scripted. Delegates give speeches applauding the glorious achievements of the socialist economy. But then, on the night of February 24th, a whisper spreads among the Soviet delegates. Come back to the Great Hall of the Kremlin for a special closed session.
The security was incredibly tight.
No journalists are allowed in, no foreign communist delegates from other countries, just the inner circle of the Soviet apparatus. It is midnight, the massive doors are locked, and Nikita Khrushchev steps up to the podium.
He begins to read a report formally titled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. Today, it's universally known as the Secret Speech. He utilized the findings of the Pospelev Commission, a special investigative committee he had secretly formed to look into the repressions of the 1930s.
And the numbers were shocking.
The raw numbers he read to the assembled delegates were staggering. He officially confirmed that in just the years 1937 and 1938, over 1.5 million individuals were arrested for anti-Soviet activities, and 680,500 of them were executed.
But he didn't just stand there and read a dry statistical report. He read the agonizing, highly personal letters of loyal communists who had been destroyed by the machine. He reads the letter of Robert Icke, the man whose eye Beria watched get gouged out.
Yeah.
Icke had managed to write a desperate plea to Stalin from prison, saying, I am innocent. I was forced to accuse myself because I could not suffer the tortures. They utilized the knowledge that my broken ribs have not properly mended. He reads the courtroom plea of Jan Ruzitok, who stood before his executioners and begged them to tell the Central Committee that the NKVD was forcing innocent people to confess to non-existent plots.
Khrushchev deliberately exposed the literal mechanics of the terror to the people who had survived it. He detailed how specific NKVD officers, like a man named Zhukovsky, operated. He read transcripts showing how Zhukovsky offered prisoners a grim bargain: hot food, clean clothes, and a promise of life if they would just memorize a fabricated script outlining a fake terrorist center. He laid bare the absurdity of the enemy of the people doctrine. He showed how it was used purely as a bureaucratic tool to annihilate anyone who disagreed with Stalin's capricious will.
The accounts of the physical reaction inside that room are visceral. These are hardened communist officials. Many of them had survived the purges themselves by keeping their heads down. As Khrushchev reads these letters, stripping away the myth of the infallible Stalin, delegates are openly weeping.
Some were literally fainting in shock.
Dmitry Goryanov, the tough editor of Komsomolskaya Pravda, has to frantically swallow 5 nitroglycerin pills to keep his heart from failing. Another prominent editor, Sergei Mizintsev, stumbles out of the hall, looking, as a witness described, white as snow, or more gray than white, like the color of salt marshes. He stammers to a colleague, "God knows what we're supposed to think will happen next."
It was a collective psychological trauma being confronted and validated in real time. The absolute bedrock of their reality, the infallible wisdom of Comrade Stalin, the guiding light of the revolution, was being shattered with a sledgehammer by their new leader.
It's wild.
At the end of the speech, Khrushchev warned them that the contents must not leak to the outside world. He said, "Otherwise, our enemies will chop us down at the roots."
But of course, a secret told to thousands of people is no longer a secret. It leaked almost immediately. The text was distributed to local party units across the country to prepare the lower ranks, meaning millions of Soviet citizens heard it read aloud. The Polish communist government got a copy and printed it. A copy leaked to a Reuters journalist. Eventually, Israeli intelligence acquired a copy from a Polish journalist, handed it to the CIA, and the New York Times published it in full. The shockwave was global, and it was violently destructive to Soviet interests.
The geopolitical fallout was immense and immediate. In Stalin's home country of Georgia, the sudden denunciation of their national hero sparked massive pro-Stalin riots in Tbilisi. The Soviet army had to be called in, and they fired on the protesters, killing dozens, perhaps hundreds. The speech completely detonated the illusion of socialist unity in Eastern Europe. The admission that the center in Moscow was fallible sparked the Polish October uprising.
And Hungary.
It directly catalyzed the bloody Hungarian Revolution of 1956, where students tore down massive bronze statues of Stalin and fought Soviet tanks in the streets of Budapest. Furthermore, it caused a massive, irreparable schism with Mao Zedong in China. Mao viewed the denunciation of Stalin as a revisionist betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles, leading directly to the Sino-Soviet split.
But I want to critically examine Khrushchev's motives here, because listening to the structure of the speech, it sounds less like a brave, moral truth-telling and a lot more like extreme PR damage control. He's basically saying to the party, look, the Communist Party is great, Lenin's theories are perfect, the ideology is absolutely flawless, we just had a really bad CEO who abused his power and hired a psychopath like Beria.
Your assessment aligns perfectly with the consensus of modern historians. The secret speech was a brilliant, but highly selective and deeply self-serving political strategy.
Really?
If you analyze the text, Khrushchev heavily focused his outrage on Stalin's crimes against loyal party members. He mourned the Old Bolsheviks, he mourned the military commanders, but he completely ignored the millions of ordinary citizens who suffered.
Right.
He didn't mention the millions of peasants who starved to death during forced collectivization. He ignored the Katyn massacre of the Polish POWs. He ignored the brutal mass deportations of entire ethnic minorities like the Crimean Tatars and the Chechens.
And crucially, he conveniently ignores his own role. Khrushchev was a high-ranking official during the Great Purge. He was the party boss in Moscow and later in Ukraine. He personally signed thousands of death warrants.
Exactly the point the Polish philosopher Leszek Kuskowski made years later. By placing all the blame squarely on the paranoia of Joseph Stalin and the treacherous sadism of Lavrenti Beria, Khrushchev attempted to absolve the system itself. And by absolving the system, he absolved himself and the surviving leadership.
It's incredible how he spun it.
He framed the terror as a bizarre aberration of a great socialist system, a temporary illness, rather than acknowledging it as the logical, inevitable conclusion of a system built entirely on absolute power, ideological fanaticism, and a total lack of democratic accountability. The speech offered no structural explanation for how a bloodthirsty paranoiac could exercise unlimited power over 200 million people for 25 years without the system itself bearing the ultimate responsibility.
Okay, let's bring this all together. The arc of this deep dive is truly staggering. The Soviet terror machine was built in the chaotic fires of a revolution, initially designed as a shield to devour the state's military enemies. But its underlying logic, the absolute necessity that enemies must always exist to justify the state's monopoly on violence, demanded constant fuel. Ultimately, the machine consumed its own builders.
Yeah, it really did.
It ate Yezhov. It ate the Old Bolsheviks. It ate Lavrenti Beria, the very man who industrialized the slaughter. It kept churning until the survivors, terrified for their own lives and realizing the economic futility of the Gulag, were forced to dismantle its worst parts just to survive the peace.
And this is not just dark, distant history. It is a timeless, crucial lesson about the fragility of truth and legality. When a society begins to weaponize a vague, undefinable label like enemy of the people and prioritizes absolute ideological loyalty over objective reality and due process, no one is safe, not even the architects of the system. The mechanism of terror, once it is uncoupled from the constraints of law and morality, possesses its own terrifying, self-sustaining momentum. It becomes an administrative process that demands victims to justify its budget and its existence.
It brings us right back to where we started, the closed loop, the machine that eats itself. It leaves you with a lingering, provocative thought. If Khrushchev hadn't taken the massive geopolitical risk of giving that secret speech, of breaking the spell of infallibility, would the terror have inevitably returned? Look at the systems of power, mass surveillance, and orthodox thinking in our modern world. How close are we even now to building bureaucratic machines that require constant enemies to justify their own funding and existence? It's something to think about. Keep diving deep.